Take me through the basic facts.
Okay.
Just off the top.
Well, I think one thing to note is when people think a drug is harmless, there is an increase in the uptake of use of the drug. And that seems to be where we're at right at the moment with marijuana. I think there's some pretty fascinating facts that Canadians are some amongst the highest users of marijuana in the world, and that Canadian youth are using much more than in other countries. So we have, I think, for the longest time established this notion that it's harmless. And I think with the legalization, people think it's even more so. The government wouldn't legalize it if there was a problem with it. And as we know that as the brain is developing in the adolescent period, it's vulnerable for things like THC. There's natural receptors for THC in the brain. And it's your brain is actually building the part of itself, the prefrontal cortex, that supports executive functions and emotional regulation. And that particular part of the brain is quite vulnerable during the teenage years. And it's also what leads to a person's success. So if you don't get it correct in adolescence, there is some room for working on it later on. But if you start using this drug, the chances that all of those connections will happen in the right sort of ways become somewhat diminished. So I think there is an additional risk to youth who use marijuana because it is not without its effects in the brain. Okay, having said that, people who use it as an adolescent show if they have a particular vulnerability. So depending on your genetic makeup, some people are more vulnerable to the effects of THC than others. And if you happen to have a vulnerability, it can increase your likelihood of developing a mental health disorder like schizophrenia or depression quite a bit. So it can increase it by 3 times up to 15 times more likely to develop such disorders if you happen to have that kind of a genetic vulnerability. And people typically don't know. So it's like playing Russian roulette with your brain if you're not aware of the sort of person that you are via your genetic makeup. So there are some concerns there. But clearly, when you start using in adolescence, you're more likely to become dependent on the drug. 6 times more likely to become dependent on the drug than if you wait until you're fully mature. Now, what most people probably don't want to hear is your brain is not fully mature until it's 25. And in males, it may even be 5 years behind that, so around 30 years of age. It's males in Canada that are using the drug the most, and their brain is more immature than females. So it's almost twice more often used in the male adolescent population than the female population. So these are all points to consider, I think, that you want to build a brain that's going to serve you in good stead as an adult and help you be successful. Marijuana is probably something that you won't want to try until you're actually finished developing your brain.
So, I mean, okay, you get it legalized, and you got 2 points of view. One, it's like, well, it's fine because it's a harmless drug, and then or we just need to stop arresting these people, and then 2, marijuana is probably the worst thing on the face of the earth, and so take me through what the facts are.
Okay, well, everybody has their own version of facts, and that's why it makes it a little bit difficult because some people view the research and the literature as being very forgiving in the front of marijuana. So let me just take you back a few steps, and that is there has been considerable research done on marijuana, but marijuana these days is different than the drug from the 70s. So when I was a young person and in high school, that drug was far less potent than what young people are being exposed to today. So it's increased at least 3 times in its potency, and in some cases 4 times in its potency. So we're not dealing with apples and we're dealing with apples and oranges, actually. It's not the same thing as what a lot of the studies were done on, which sort of negates the findings that it didn't seem to have huge effects, because we're now dealing with something far more potent, and it's clear that in brains that are developing, this potency actually makes a difference as far as the wiring and the connection and so on and so forth. So I do think that you do want to exercise caution when you think that you're dealing with a drug that is something that's safe, because clearly we need to get out to the public more information so they can make good choices about whether or not this is something they want to try.
Now, you have sort of taken us down the path of the adolescence factor, and quite comprehensively, which I appreciate. what I want to touch on now is of course, it seems, if somebody is going to use, and it seems the ideal situation is, okay, male over 30, female over 25. So, of course, it doesn't mean that it's harmless in that case. And so what are the ways in which somebody even then could get into trouble?
Okay, well, here's what we know now. It turns out that things that your parents did before they conceived you, both mother and father, have an impact on the offspring. So if you're a heavy user of marijuana in the preconception period as a father, the chances that you're going to pass something on in the genome to your future children is pretty high. We also know that the same is true for mothers. But for instance, it has been published in the literature that fathers who are users of marijuana before they conceive children are more likely to have children who die from sudden infant death syndrome, for instance. That's just one of the examples. We also know that if mothers are using while they're pregnant, the THC actually competes with natural receptors in the brain to help guide connections in the developing brain. And then these brains get wired up in ways that are less than optimal, and then they tend to have issues behaviorally later on. And it starts right from babyhood, and you start to see these deficits in behavior as a child develops. So I do think people need to be aware that there are these possible consequences of using as an adult if there's children in the future. These effects can be passed off on to them.
Now, I want to examine, of course, so it becomes legal, and maybe you do see an uptick in people who I guess use it recreationally. So let's go ahead and hope that those who are going to use it recreationally are going to do so responsibly.
Right.
It seems that is something that is possible to do without any sort of major harmful effects.
It absolutely is.
And so then back to the sort of the genetic thing. I mean, if somebody's using and they're doing it occasionally, again, which is the hope, then what would be signs that they would see in themselves that would maybe tell them I should stop?
If their behavior is such that they start focusing a lot on, I'd really like another one of those. That's kind of how people who smoke cigarettes feel. After it's been a period of time when you typically have a cigarette, you start to really focus on, that cigarette, that's what I need right now. When you start to feel those kinds of things, you may be on a phase of starting to become dependent on the drug, and it is possible to become dependent on this drug. Another thing I can see as a sign of worry is people who want to build it into their edibles like brownies and such. It's really difficult to monitor the dosage, and there have been a huge uptick in the number of admissions in emergency rooms from people who are using THC because they have accidentally overdosed themselves. And what comes along with that is really scary sometimes. Side effects like psychotic episodes where you feel you're hearing voices and there's things happening that cannot be true, and so on and so forth. So it can be that way. Having said that, there are some obvious medical benefits for marijuana, and I can sort of see why people would be interested in exploring those kinds of realms. It does make you feel bliss. It's tapping into our natural bliss receptors. So you do feel calmer when you take it, and it helps a lot of people who have issues with anxiety get through that sort of thing. We also know people who have epilepsy. It calms the cells down in the brain, so they're less likely to have an epileptic episode. There's also people who suffer from intractable pain who report that this makes them feel better. So clearly it's not, there's two sides of this picture that people have to understand, and that's why I think it's so important for public awareness here on this particular issue, because now we're going to make it freely available. How do we make sure it doesn't get into the hands of children who are maybe making rash decisions? Sometimes adolescents are not known for their best decision-making capabilities, but clearly I think we have a responsibility to protect those who are vulnerable with its use, and to support those who use it and can use it in ways that make their lives better. So, and with legalization, actually, a lot of people think it's just a bad idea, but I think it's a way of controlling what's in the drug. It's a way of a person being more assured of what they're getting, because right now, when you're buying it off somebody on the street, you have no idea whether it's contaminated with other drugs. People have been known to have purchased this with fentanyl mixed in, so they become dependent on drugs that are harder on a person and harder to move away from. If you've had one or two exposures, it becomes even more a dependency than it would be if it was just the marijuana itself. So I think there's a lot to consider in the bigger global picture here. And I really hope that any money they make off selling it, the government, they will reinvest in public awareness campaigns, and they will reinvest in research that help us understand better the true picture of what the marijuana that we have access to these days is really doing to brain and body and development in the human population.
Now, you're giving me tons of good information. I just want to make sure I check all the boxes
Yep,
here.
yep.
So something that I am, I was at the community issues.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The
Yeah, were you there?
No, I didn't. I didn't make it. I was away. I was out of town.
There was one mother who was just asking, look, I'm out in my backyard and somebody next door is smoking, what are the ins and the outs of sort of, you inhale it, you become intoxicated that way, like just take me through that.
Well, that's the problem. It's just like secondhand cigarette smoke. If you're exposed to it, you do suffer a consequence from it. If it's the kind of thing you're looking for or hoping for, that you feel pretty good without actually having to light up one yourself, it can happen. It really depends on the amount and what kind of a space you're in, and closed spaces are obviously worse than if you're in the open air, but there's nothing to say that there isn't secondhand effects, just like there is with cigarette smoke. And we do know that some of the secondhand effects of cigarette smoke are very, very serious. So in the smoke inversion, you can still have people who have respiratory issues as a result of being exposed to that in an environment. So you may not be actively smoking, but around people who are, and you can suffer some of the respiratory effects of irritation. It can be a difficult drug to smoke because it does seem to irritate and make people's voices hoarse if they've been smoking quite a lot. So I think there's another physical side to the whole thing about just the smoke piece. But the secondhand smoke it's an issue, and it's something that needs to be considered. Would you want somebody smoking in a vehicle if there's children in the vehicle? Probably not. It's not a well-ventilated space. I think people have to really be careful in not only their use with themselves, but what they're exposing other people to.
And then in the inhalation of becoming high that way, is adolescence still the heightened concern?
It is rather, because they're looking for something, and some people believe that they want to know on a scale of, is alcohol worse or is this worse? And the fact of the matter is, it's worse if you're addicted to it. And so we do know that just as with adolescence and alcohol, you're more likely to become dependent on it if you start using as an adolescent. You're more likely to become dependent on this drug if you start using as a young person. But there's no good data to say, no, alcohol is much worse, this is a safer way to go. I think people thinking it's safer are not grasping the whole picture of how do you know what your body's going to react to. Some people are completely unable to drink alcohol because they haven't got the right enzymes in their liver, and they're very sensitive to it. And I'm sure that there will be all kinds of folks that will be identified that find themselves very sensitive to marijuana as well. So it comes with, alcohol being a freely available drug, but it doesn't come without its social issues and its huge problems. And as a matter of fact, it's one of the biggest issues as far as addictions go in the world these days. So just by making it legal doesn't mean it's safe. And I think people need to understand that.
No, and I think I just have a couple more questions for
you.
I mean, I don't want to predict because you're giving me a lot of information and sometimes takes me down different paths. But, of course, we're looking at bylaws to say, okay, you can't set up shop near a school. Mm-hmm. We've already seen towns that have said no public usage whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, given that it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that marijuana in the air might even be more harmful than secondhand smoke.
Yeah, I don't know. You see, and here's the thing, we just don't know. With the kind of marijuana that's available now, if people start widely using, we have no idea. But what I do know is Canadians use it more than others, and that young Canadians use it more than in other populations in the world. So I think we might be opening Pandora's box, but how do you know until you try it? It might actually work out better because people can right now walk downtown and buy it on almost any corner. So it's readily available. Everybody who wants it knows how to find it, or knows somebody who knows how to find it. And at least we'd be protecting their interest in making sure if they bought it from a government source or a government sourced outlet, that they would be getting what they're hoping to get and not additional things in it.
And then, hopefully my last question.
Yeah.
Looking, again, back to the mother at the meeting, looking specifically at babies and toddlers.
Yeah.
Like, is there anything that parents can do to protect their kids?
Well, I would not have them anywhere in an environment where there's lots of smoking going on. If it's I would not have them there. I would just, to protect them, I wouldn't. I know a lot of younger people are vaping it now. That's something I wasn't even aware of, that you could do such a thing, but apparently it is totally, where a lot of young people find that they want to try it that way and think it's harmless because you don't get the smoke along with it. But there's all kinds of other consequences that come along with that kind of exposure. But as far as parents with young children, I guess it'll remain to be seen what the bylaws are, how it comes out in Alberta. Are they going to make it at-home private use only? Will people be respectful of others in a home and smoke it outside? If they smoke it outside, what happens then? It's really hard to predict. I haven't got a strong sense of what will happen. There's a lot of people who would never use, and they don't view that kind of thing as the right sort of thing to do to themselves or their children or anybody around them. And there's a lot of people who are anxious to try it. And remarkably, my mom and dad are in their 80s and 90s, and they think it might be fun. So I really don't know what's going to happen. It's really going to be hard to predict.
And if there is anything, like, are there any cities that show a different effect on seniors?
I don't think there has been any study done on seniors. But here's the rub. Seniors, as they get older, have less cognitive, what they call cognitive reserve. So if as a senior you start using heavily, you may show a more rapid decline as far as your ability to manage other things in your life. But I know of no good study, and that's why this money needs to come back into research, so we know better how to counsel populations who are interested but maybe want to try it but don't know if it's going to have consequences. I wish I knew. I don't recall having ever seen a study on seniors.
Okay, so seniors, adolescents, fully developed brain, air inhalation. I feel like we've covered the different avenues. Is there anything that we've missed?
Well, I do think that people need to understand that it used to be thought that if you were a cocaine user, that's what ends you up in hospital and that's what ends you up into trouble. Or if you're a heroin user, that's what ends you up in hospital or into trouble. But the stats these days are more of the emergency room admittances are through marijuana and maybe some other comorbid use of drugs like alcohol. Those are the people who are showing up now needing attention, and so there's a higher burden on our medical system. And clearly it's going to end up whatever is gained by selling it through government outlets, much of it I think is going to get used up in other ways, and I think we have to be aware it's not going to be a cash cow for folks as far as more money available to serve the public.